Welcome back to the Reading and Writing Podcast. I'm joined on the podcast today by New York Times bestselling writer Charles Soule, author of the new novel, The Endless Vessel. Ping Shepard, bestselling author of The Cartographers, wrote about the novel. The Endless Vessel is a thrilling hunt, haunting mystery, and ominous prediction all in one. But most of all, it's a poignant reminder of what it means to be human, to despair, to love, and to refuse to give up hope, even in the final hour. In addition to his latest novel, Soule is the author of the Star Wars novel, Star Wars Light of Jedi. He is also the author of some of the most prominent comic book stories of the last decade for Marvel, DC, and Lucasfilm, including a groundbreaking run on Daredevil, the mega bestsellers Death of Wolverine and Darth Vader, and a run on She-Hulk that served as an inspiration for the Disney Plus television show. Charles, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me on. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Well, if someone hasn't yet heard about your new novel, The Endless Vessel, how would you describe the novel?
Well, I mean, Peng actually did a pretty good job in that quote you just read. It is a big, sprawling epic with some science fiction elements to it. That is ultimately kind of a speculative fiction story about a group of people who, a couple centuries ago, found this incredible treasure. And the treasure that they found was essentially the secret to happiness. And they decided they were going to keep it safe and keep it to themselves. So they built a ship, and they've been sailing on that ship ever since for about 250 years. And the protagonist of the story, whose name is Lily Barnes, she's a materials engineer who is British but lives in Hong Kong, is kind of gets wind of these people in a way. And she is operating in a world that has been affected by essentially a despair plague. So people are being afflicted with this malaise called the gray that is just dragging everybody down, which I don't think is that difficult to relate to for the world we're living in right now.
Sure.
And she decides that she's going to find these people. And so it's sort of a treasure hunt for both this group who are on this ship that's been sailing nonstop, but also a hunt for the secret to happiness, which for me, again, I think is going to be pretty relatable to people right now. And I'm really proud of what it does. That the book spans a lot of time. There are historical elements to it. It goes back in time and explores the origin of this society on this ship, but also is very of the moment. It's set in literally, the Hong Kong of right now, and the England of right now, and the America of right now, and is hopefully very relatable to anybody who's living in these crazy times we're experiencing right now.
Do you remember the original idea or impetus that led you to writing The Endless Vessel?
I do. It was the ship. The ship that never stopped sailing was an idea that I had years ago. I just thought it was really interesting. I'm a big fan of Patrick O'Brien's novels, the Aubrey Maturin novels, Horatio Hornblower, anything with kind of sort of Age of Sail set stuff I've always really liked. And so I wanted to give my attempt at doing something like that with a big sailing ship with 3 masts and the whole thing. But I also was very interested in this moment in time. This is a pandemic book, meaning it was written during the pandemic and the quarantine years. And so it is directly approaching some of the things that I think we've all been looking at, whether it's, human connection and what we're supposed to be doing with our lives and how we can move forward out of times of great catastrophe and difficulty. So it was really those two elements. The literal ship I just liked. I wanted to write about a ship, and then really trying to do an examination of this very strange moment we found ourselves living in.
Well, as I mentioned in the intro, you're a successful comic book writer. You write your own novels. You've written a successful Star Wars novel. What was your initial writing journey? Were you writing stories and novels initially, or were you writing comic scripts? And what led you to your first publications?
Sure. Well, I've often been asked a question that's basically a variation on that, and I always tell people the start of my journey was just to go to law school, because I went to law school and realized about halfway through my third year that I might have made a terrible mistake. When I finished taking the bar exam, I took a break about a month before I went and started working at the law firm where I had a job. And that month, like on day one, I went out and bought a notebook at the local bookstore so that I could start writing my first novel in longhand. So for me, it was just a realization that I might be on the wrong path and I needed to try to write myself out of it. I started writing that first novel, which I finished and completed. It took me several years because I was working as a baby attorney at the same time. It was very difficult to scratch out the time to write a book simultaneously. But eventually I did, and then attempted to sell it. I got an agent, but the book ultimately didn't sell. And so I was disheartened, I think, as anybody would be, but I also was still a lawyer, which is not exactly what I wanted to be doing. So I continued trying to write myself out of that career, started my second book, but at the same time, I started exploring another field that I'd always loved that seemed to have both slightly lower barriers to entry and also a faster timeline to creative output, which was comics. So when you're writing comics, you're not doing it by yourself. You're doing it with an artist and letterer and colorist and the whole team. And comics is it's not a total meritocracy, but it sort of is. And part of that is because you pick up a comic, you can open it, you can see if it's beautiful at page one, whereas a novel requires more investment of time and focus. But I started working on comics. So this would have been around 2004, 2005 is when I started trying to do comics simultaneously with doing novels. And then I had my first comic published in 2009. And it took me another 4 years before I was picked up by DC Comics to start writing their book Swamp Thing. Yep. And then, the best way to start writing in Marvel Comics is to get a job at DC Comics because they all, coaching each other. And so not long after that, I started writing at Marvel. A few years after that, I started writing for Lucasfilm, for Star Wars. And it's been just sort of, I've never looked back. And I was able to use the profile that writing high-level comics gave me to get interest in my next novel, which ended up becoming my first published novel, which was The Oracle Year that came out in 2018. So I think that's the journey pretty much. I just really didn't want to be a lawyer.
And what kind of law were you doing when you were working as a lawyer?
I started doing corporate work, so deals,
sure.
Mergers and acquisitions, and then that shifted over to immigration, which was what I was doing when I found enough success in writing to be able to leave the law. So I had my own immigration practice.
Got it. Well, you mentioned that there was the first comic script that got published, and then 4 years later it was Swamp Thing. What was that first comic that was published?
It was a book called Strongman. It was put out by a company called SLG Publishing, which stands for Slave Labor Graphics. They're a very, very small publisher, but they were responsible for launching the careers of many really notable people who went on to become very notable in the comics industry. And so they have a pedigree, but they're very, very punk rock in a way. So they're like the CBGBs of comic publishers.
Sure.
And so my book Strongman was about a washed up Mexican luchador who was living in New York City and kind of was drinking his days away and didn't know what had become of himself. And it's his kind of last rodeo. So it's an old dude on a mission story that I'm still very proud of. I think it was great, but it sold hundreds of copies, if that. I think it did. I think all in all, it was around 500, which is not a lot. But if the right people are among that group of 500, then you can make something with it.
Sure.
And so the advice I always give to people whenever they're trying to enter any sort of field of business creatively is that you're on a ladder and you have access to the people on the rung you're on, the rung below you, and the rung above you. And you can use that to try to get to the next rung and to the next rung and to the next rung. And if you focus on those people that you actually have access to, every once in a while, something amazing comes by and somebody 10 rungs up the ladder takes notice, but it's not something you can depend on. So Strongman sold 500 copies, but that gave me access to other people who are also trying to get their stories out there. And so I started to create a network, and I had friends and people I would support, and they would support me. And eventually one of those people put me in touch with somebody who was able to look at my second book, which is called 27, and publish it through Image Comics, which is one of the premier, not one of it, it is the premier place to put creator-owned comics, independent comics. So having that happen was a gigantic step forward for me, and it really gave me confidence that I was going to be able to do it, and I should continue investing time and money in it.
You said that you started out and you were trying to write yourself out of this job as a lawyer, and you were writing novels, and then you made the switch to comic books. When you made that switch, had you ever seen what a comic book script looked like, and what was that process for you to figure out, just the basics of formatting and how to submit a comic book script?
Sure. This was the mid 2000s. And so the internet was around. And so I was able to find, there were things like the Comic Script Archive, which I don't think exists anymore, but there were places you could look to find how other comic writers had written their scripts in the past. Every once in a while, a comic might be published in a collected edition. It would have some of the scripts in the back. But beyond that, I was part of communities online and on message board communities, which were a big deal in that era of the internet. They've largely been replaced now by social media and Discord. But back then, there was a board called the Bendis board, which was run by a very, very prominent comics writer named Brian Michael Bendis, who was really generous with his time and his focus in terms of mentoring younger creators. And just like Slade Labor Graphics, that company that I mentioned before, SLG, the Bendis board and a couple of other different message boards that were active around that time ended up really launching the next generation of significant comics talent. And so I was in really good company in terms of people who really had the chops to become big, but had to build up their knowledge and had to, I suppose, had the potential. They didn't really have the chops yet. None of us did, but we worked really hard and supported each other and made a community that was all about trying to get our voices as comic creators into the world. And I know that I would not have been able to do it without that community and the people there. So I'm very, I'm still friends with many of them. Many of them have become my professional colleagues now, but I am still very grateful to everybody there, whether they went on to become comic creators or not, for their time and their focus. And it was really special, just that community.
That was a great resource for you. Well, I know that scripts are a very structured form. I'm curious how that carries over for you when you're working on a novel, such as The Endless Vessel, your new novel. Are you someone who does a ton of outlining and planning before writing the first word?
I think the answer is yes. I am a person who does a lot of longhand work before I start typing anything. So I will, if it's a comic, I have Moleskine notebooks that are dedicated to each title that I'm working on. And so what I'll do is usually go sit at a coffee shop or sometimes a bar or someplace where I'm just away from my normal setup, and I'll just sit there and kind of blue sky it. So I will just sit there and think about, well, what would I like this story to be? How would I like it to go? And that eventually drills down into a page-by-page breakdown of what happens on every issue, which then I turn into this. That's when I go to typing. That turns into the script. But it is extremely rare, if not completely unprecedented these days, for me to write a comic script without having done that notebook work first. So everything is always outlined, but it can be loose. I mean, I've written, God, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of comic issues at this point. And so thousands and thousands of pages. And so I have a mental shorthand, so I don't have to have every beat planned out. I just can be like, well, I know for these 3 or 4 pages, there's going to be this type of sequence or this kind of conversation, and then I'll figure it out when I'm actually in typing. But it's more of a feel, more of think of a sculptor who has like a rough version of the thing that they're sculpting, and then they'll go in with the fine chisel and make it all the detail work. So that's what the notebook work is like for comics. With novels, novels are just, they're bigger. They're infinitely more complex, as you would imagine. So the way that I handle it is I start, again, with a notebook. I have a notebook dedicated to every novel that I do. And I start really, really, really rough and loose. What am I trying to say? What is this about? What is the feel? Who are the characters? I often break those things out into their own sections at the beginning of the notebook and just start fiddling around. And it can take a while. Eventually, though, I feel like I have enough stuff that I want to set it down so it doesn't become too unwieldy in my head so that I start forgetting some of the details or forgetting some of the insights. So then I use a program called Scrivener, which I know you talk to a lot of authors, and I'm sure this is not the first time you've heard that word. Scrivener is a really, really useful word processing program that is designed specifically to bring authors from their rough notes phase to a rough draft. And it has all these different bells and whistles, and structurally it is just set up, in my opinion, very well to allow me to organize my thoughts and then start just putting it all together so that I have all my research in one tab and I have all my chapter breaks in another and my character lists, and it just starts to become a book at that point. And I work in Scrivener. I type every initial draft of every chapter in Scrivener, and then there's a big celebratory moment when I finished that and I export it to a Word document. That is so the steps in my process are notebook, Scrivener, and then we get to Word for the sort of edit process for the first really rough draft to the second draft. From there, it gets a little looser, but there is a consistency into how I've done this every time, because I am just putting the finishing touches on my, I guess technically this would be my sixth novel at this point. So, and there has not been one of them that has not gone to at least 5 drafts, usually 6 or 7. Sixth and seventh drafts can be tweaky, but they still exist. So what happens is I write that first draft in Scrivener, I export it to Word. I read the whole thing over. I'm like, wow, I really missed the mark on this. I need to do some surgery here. And then I start moving pieces around at kind of a high level. And that takes it to a second draft. And then that's usually what I let other people read. They have notes and thoughts. That takes me to a third draft. And at this point, it can be pretty dramatic. There's just between drafts. And then around the third draft is when I let what I call my stakeholders read it, which are my agent and my editor at the publisher, things like that. They have their thoughts. And the nice thing about that phase is that it often takes a little while for them to do it because they're very busy people. So I set it aside just by the nature of them needing to take some time to read it. And then they come back, when they come back to me with their notes, I've also had a lot of time for it to putter around in my self-conscious. So I put all that together, and then I create a fourth draft. The fourth draft is often should I keep going with this? I mean, I think this is what this podcast is supposed to be.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So the fourth draft for me is always the most brutal, exhausting one, because this is the one where I essentially am rewriting the book from scratch. And what I mean by that is that everything is there, all the pieces are there, but when I do my first 3 drafts, I'm not always totally as focused on perfect sentence structure or perfectly expressing ideas in the most poetic way. There are bracketed sections. There's all these things. But when I go from 3 to 4 is when I go in and say, okay, this is the book I needed. This is the one that if I had to send it to be published, I could do it. And so it is really kind of writing a whole nother book from scratch, almost. Every sentence changes pretty much, and it is exhausting. But when that's done, I have something that is close, pretty close. So by now we're on draft 4. I have other people read it, fresh readers read it. They give me their thoughts. I go back in. This is when I usually around this time have the insight of, oh, this is what I was actually writing the whole time. And I decide what elements and themes I want to pull out, what characters I want to bring a little bit more to. So that brings us to draft 5, which is pretty close to publication draft. And then I'm getting copy edits and tweaks, and a couple little ideas occur to me here and there about things I can adjust and change, which takes us usually to draft 6 or 7, which ends up being published. So writing novels is incredibly labor intensive for me, but I think the results hopefully speak for themselves. I've always been very proud of every book I've written.
That was a very thorough explanation. Thanks for that. So I just wanted to go back for a moment to your comic book writing. When you're writing a run on a particular title or a particular character, very similar to TV, there can be a story arc over multiple issues. And as a writer, how are you doing that pacing and thinking ahead? Are you breaking it down 6 issues ahead, 12 issues ahead? How does that tend to work for you?
It depends on the assignment to some degree. I think generally it's 6-issue arcs, but there are stories that are designed as 12-issue stories from the beginning. There are stories that are designed as 4-issue stories, even 2-issue stories or one-shots. And so it really just depends. These days, I'm doing a lot of work in Star Wars comics primarily, and so those often have set lengths that I know what I'm going to be doing ahead of time. So I just kind of, if it's just like if you're going to write a novella or a short story or a novel, you know basically the size of the playground, and you figure it out within that. And it's an interesting thing because I can generally tell ahead of time how much story I have, and I think that's just honed from many years of telling story basically day in and day out in all these different ways. It's just like a musician who kind of knows how to play their instrument. That's how my story sense is.
Right. So I have a question. I'm not sure you'll be able to articulate this, but I wanted to ask it. When you're thinking about writing about comic book characters who have been around for decades and have been written about for decades with numerous storylines, how do you as an author approach that to bring something to those characters and stories that is uniquely yours?
Well, the first thing you do is you read as much, if not all, of those prior stories as you can, because that's the source material. That's what those are the giant shoulders that you're going to be standing on. And when you do that, you get a sense of the runs that have become legendary and the runs that were a little less, they weren't as universally acclaimed perhaps as some of the really classic ones. And so it gives you a sense of what people care about with the character, what they will accept, what they will reject. And so that's sort of phase one. But phase two is, okay, what is unique about me that's going to bring something to this character that's interesting that hasn't been seen before? A great example is Daredevil and She-Hulk, two characters that I wrote for Marvel. They're both lawyers, but they had never been written by a lawyer before. So I put a lot of my own legal background into writing those characters, and it creates a unique flavor to them that we hadn't really seen before, which I'm very happy that I was able to do and got the opportunity to do that. With Star Wars, it's different because so many people have experienced Star Wars over the generations that it's for me, it's about what questions haven't been answered. So I think about it from the perspective of what is the thing about Luke Skywalker that in all of the Luke Skywalker storytelling we've seen, we haven't seen this question answered. And so then I go look at it that way. Same with Darth Vader, same with Chewbacca, you name it. And that seems to generate pretty good results. And then obviously with my own stories, it's more, what is the thing I want to put out into the world? What is the story that hasn't been told by anybody that I think I'm the right person to tell?
Well, as you said, you have written hundreds of issues of various comic titles and characters. If someone listening would like to check out some of your comics work, is there a particular run that you would point them to?
Absolutely. I mean, there's some really, really cool stuff in there. If you're a Star Wars fan, I would point you toward, I did a run on Darth Vader with Giuseppe Camicoli on the art. That is people really, really seem to like it. I'm also writing the Star Wars flagship story right now that I would recommend. Beyond that, if you are a fan of Daredevil, I did a long run on that. That is also very well received, that I think people really like. My She-Hulk run, people seem to really like that. I've been very fortunate that a lot of my work has been well received. If you're an X-Men fan, I did a bunch of work in that zone with a bunch of stories with Wolverine and the Astonishing X-Men, which is all stuff I'm really proud of. Outside of that, I would recommend my book 8 Billion Genies, which just came out. It just finished up its run. Its 8-issue run in May and is coming out in a beautiful hardcover edition this July from Image Comics. I did a book called Letter 44 that I really think is great. Yeah, that's probably the list right now, but there's really a whole bunch. I should say, I just finished another comic with my friend Will Sliney on the art called Hell to Pay, which is all about, it's basically a horror story where capitalism is the monster. And it's, I think it's good. I mean, I've been very productive in the last 10 years. I've written many stories, and I'm proud of all of them. And I'm happy that I've gotten to work with so many amazing artists and creative collaborators on all of those tales.
Well, given all of your work, both on comics and novels, what writing advice would you offer for those who are writing their own comic book scripts or short stories or novels?
Well, do it because you love it. Don't do it for any particular. I mean, you can keep the goals in mind in terms of, well, I'd like to be a novelist for a job. I'd like to make comics for a living. Those are fine goals to have, but they're very difficult to achieve. And even if you achieve them, what sees you through the really long hours and intense focus and challenges required to live a creative life are that you love being creative, and it's impossible to think of living any other way. So I'd say start with that. Know that you love it. Know that you would make sacrifices to do it. Know that you would do it even if you weren't being paid to do it, which is really what got me where I am. I think is really just that decision that I was going to do this no matter what. I've been very fortunate in my career, but ultimately it is something that I would do even if I wasn't as successful at it as I am. I just love telling stories too much. So that's it. The other thing I would do is do your homework. This is not a field, whether it's novels or comics, you can't just intuit it as much as people kind of think they can. There's a friend of mine named Jim Zub, who is another comics writer who gives great advice to up and coming creators. He often gives this example of, you go to a fancy restaurant and you love the food and it's so good. And so you go back to the kitchen and you say, well, wow, I would like to be a chef here now, because they'd be like, what are you talking about? Do you have any qualifications? And you say, well, yeah, I love the food. I love eating food. Food is amazing. And this food is really good. So I want to be a chef here. And that is kind of what it's like to assume that you're just going to be able to work in Marvel or DC Comics or even as a high-level novelist or any of those things without putting in the hours and putting in the training and really learning the craft. And not just the craft, but the business, because there are paths in and there are networks you have to build and there are a lot of things you have to understand, just like you have to understand creating the work, you have to understand selling it, you have to understand marketing it and promoting it. So it's a long path. I mean, I gave that timeline at the beginning of this interview because I wanted people to hear it. I started writing my first novel in the year 2000, and my first novel was not published until 2018. So it took 18 years for my first book to be published, my first novel. I started trying to write comics in 2004, and I didn't actually have my first significant Big 2 comic published until 2013. So that took 9 years. So the road is long, and I don't think that I was particularly slow. I just think it takes forever. But as you're climbing that ladder, as you're walking that road, every step of it, every rung of it is exciting, and there are milestones along the way that are very joyful. And you make friends and you make connections, and all of those things really, really help make the length of the journey you don't even think about it because it's wonderful every step of the way.
Have you started thinking about or writing a new novel beyond the one that just came out?
I have. I have a novel that is going to be coming out in the spring of 2025, which is another Star Wars novel. My last Star Wars novel, Light of the Jedi, was sort of the start of this big kind of multi-year publishing initiative that Lucasfilm has been doing, launching this new era in Star Wars called the High Republic. And my next novel, Trials of the Jedi, is the one that is going to close out that era for the time being, or close off the big story that we've been telling anyway. So that is the thing I'm going to start working on in earnest in the fall, which seems awfully soon now that I think about it. And then I have my next novel after that, which I am very excited about too. The thing that I'm just completing now. So Endless Vessel just came out this week and it's in stores now. I think it's really good. I think people should definitely check it out. I also wrote a companion novella to it called Chronicles of the Lazarine. It's actually a pretty long novella. It's novel length now, I think. So it's called Chronicles of the Lazarine, and it is a sort of semi-sequel direct companion piece to Endless Vessel. So that is, I did a Kickstarter for it to get it out to the world that ran in April. So that is now done and is going to be going out to all those Kickstarter backers soon. And I'm working on trying to figure out the best way to get that story to non-Kickstarter backers too. So there's that. And then once all that stuff is done, I know what my next novel is going to be, which will end up being, I suppose, my 7th. And that I don't anticipate starting to write until into end of 24, start of 25. But it's pretty wonderful to think that I have these opportunities, that I'm barring something really terrible happening. I don't even know why I said that, knock on wood, barring some real change of path for me, I'm going to be writing novels for years to come, which is a really wonderful thing to be able to say.
Yep, that's wonderful. Well, what novels or comic books have you read recently that you enjoyed?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. I read a novel by R.F. Kuang called Babel that I really liked. I thought that was really strong. It is sort of speculative fiction based around translation and a whole sort of magic system built in Oxford in the 1800s based around the idea of translated languages. And I'm a big language person, so I thought that was really excellent stuff. Also, I read recently that I really liked. There's a book called Ascendance that just came out that I really enjoyed. I'm looking at my Audible account as we speak because I'm a runner, and so I listen to a lot of books while I run, which is
right.
It's fun. Sylvain Neuvel is a writer that I'm friendly with, and I think he's just incredible. He wrote a trilogy called To the Stars, and the third book of that trilogy just came out called For the First Time Again. But I recommend anything he does. He has written, I think, 6 novels that are all really strong. I just finished Ninth House by Lee Bardugo. I don't know, so many. I'm a pretty. The Mountain in the Sea by Ray Naylor was really good. The last Stephen King fairy tale was excellent. I'm a pretty voracious reader. I'm always reading stuff, and I would put my name on any of those books as endorsing them. They're all great.
Well, where can people find you online if they want to learn more about you and your novels and comic books?
Well, the best way to find me is via my website, which is charlessoule.com. Just Charles, Soule.com. That also will give you a prompt to sign up to my newsletter, which is very low impact. It's free, and it comes out about once a month, sometimes twice a month if there's a lot going on, but usually once a month. And it just gives you updates on everything I'm writing, tells you how to get my stuff, gives you updates on everything I'm sort of doing and running around and appearances and exclusive stuff and what have you. So I would say that's the best way, especially in this weird era for social media. But I also am very active on Twitter under Charles Soule. I'm just, my name is my handle. Same thing on Blue Sky. On Instagram, it's Charles D. Soule. So those are really the main spots to find me. Again, I really recommend the newsletter. If this all sounds interesting, you want to follow up with more stuff, go to the website. You'll see it right away. But also, if you kind of want dumb jokes and stupid pictures, you've got Instagram and Twitter and Blue Sky.
Hey, well, again, we've been speaking to Charles Soule, author of the new novel, The Endless Vessel. The novel is available now, so go buy a copy. And Charles, thanks for doing this interview.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely.